You know, in any really intense pursuit, I feel like the most critical skill isn't actually knowing how to keep a project alive.
Oh, definitely not.
Right. It's knowing when to walk away, just knowing when to let a beautiful thing stay sitting right there on the shelf.
Yeah, that restraint is so rare.
It really is. And welcome to today's deep dive, everyone, because today we're looking at a brilliant, highly specific documentation of that exact friction, that war between aesthetic impulse and practical reality.
That's a fascinating source we have today.
Yeah, we're pulling a single entry from this massive ongoing gardening journal. It's called Notes on Gardening, Part 870, by an author named Eng, published today, actually, April 18th, 2026.
I mean, just the title, Part 870, that implies a staggering volume of work.
Right, like who writes 870 parts of anything?
Exactly. To be at that number means you're looking at the writing of someone who has systematically documented seasons of failure, unexpected successes, and just the slow, grinding reality of dealing with living organisms.
Yeah, it's not a beginner's blog.
No, not at all. But what makes this specific entry so compelling is the vulnerability. It isn't, a dry scientific manual logging soil pH levels.
Oh, thank goodness.
Right. It's a real-time psychological snapshot of a gardener actively wrestling with temptation in the middle of a plant nursery.
Our mission today is basically to trace that intersection.
Okay.
Right. We're exploring botanical curiosity and the sheer practical discipline required in gardening, all through the lens of one very specific plant.
The pink trumpet vine.
Yes, scientifically known as Podranea ricasoliana. Did I say that right?
You did, yeah. Podranea ricasoliana.
Okay, great. So to understand the weight of this encounter, you really have to look at the psychological armor that Eng puts on before even stepping foot near the vines.
The preemptive defenses.
Exactly. So Eng states up front that this trip to the nursery was entirely unplanned, like just popped in. But more critically, there's this documented pre-existing reluctance toward vine species as a whole.
Which is an interesting boundary to set.
Yeah, and Eng cites two very logical reasons for it. First, a lack of physical space in the garden. And second, an admitted uncertainty about how to properly train a vine against a wall or a trellis.
And, establishing those boundaries is essentially a survival mechanism.
How so?
Well, a plant nursery is basically designed to overwhelm your senses. By immediately articulating those limitations, spatial constraints, and skill gaps, Eng is trying to anchor to reality.
Like tying yourself to the mast.
Exactly. It's an acknowledgement that horticulture isn't just about what looks pretty in a pot. It's an architectural commitment. You need the square footage, and you need the technical competence to manipulate the plant's growth over time.
Okay, let's unpack this a bit, though, because I wonder if that self-awareness is actually just a defense mechanism failing in real time.
What do you mean?
Well, Eng is walking the aisles of this nursery, essentially saying, I don't have the space for a vine, and I don't have the skills for a vine. But Eng is still lingering in the vine section.
Oh, right.
It's like going to the animal shelter just to look when you live in a tiny studio apartment. You know you absolutely do not have the space for a high-energy Great Dane, but you go look at them anyway.
That is a perfect analogy. You're preemptively justifying an impulsive purchase.
Right. You list all the reasons you shouldn't do it, but secretly you're hoping one specific item is spectacular enough to shatter your own rules.
And the stakes are definitely set by that internal monologue. When you build up logical barriers, whatever manages to break through them has to possess a disruptive level of allure.
It can't just be cute.
Exactly. A mild distraction won't work. It has to be a sensory hijacking. And that is precisely what happens when Eng encounters the pink trumpet vine. The practical defenses just collapse under the weight of sheer visual impact.
It's wild. Eng stops dead, the camera comes out, and the documentation begins. And the journal gives us this incredibly vivid breakdown of the flower.
The aesthetic details are so striking.
Yeah, we get the large bell-shaped pink petals, but the hyperfocus lands on one specific, almost microscopic detail. It's these striking magenta veins deep in the throat of the flower.
Which, if we connect this to the bigger picture, is so fascinating. The anatomy of that flower is biologically engineered to draw you in.
Like a trap.
Well, a visual funnel. The broad, pale pink bells serve as the billboard, right? But those dark, concentrated magenta pathways leading inward are the actual target. In nature, those are nectar guides for pollinators.
Okay, so they literally point the bugs to the good stuff.
Precisely. Visually funneling insects toward the reproductive center of the flower. But human psychology responds to that same visual funneling. We are drawn into the depth of the throat, just marveling at the contrast and the architecture of the coloration.
It's just so interesting because the language Aang uses feels slightly visceral, magenta veins in the
That's
throat.
very anatomical.
Right. It transforms the plant from just a passive piece of foliage into something almost living, breathing. But here's where it gets really interesting to me. Right after this intense, magnified visual inspection, Aang drops a detail that completely contradicts this hyper-observant mindset.
The part about the smell.
Yes. Aang writes that the flower is, quote, said to have a light, sweet fragrance, while freely admitting to not having actually leaned in to smell it.
That omission is just a brilliant window into cognitive load.
Wait, really? Because to me, it seems absurd. Isn't it funny how we humans will accept the rumored reputation of a thing? You're standing inches away from a stunning flower. You're close enough to map the microscopic veins inside its throat, but you rely on the internet for the scent.
It does sound funny, but there's a reason for it.
Like, why accept the lore of a thing when you could just lean forward 2 inches and verify the fragrance with your own nose?
Because the visual processing system has completely monopolized the brain's bandwidth in that moment.
Oh, wow. So you're saying the eyes are hogging all the energy.
Exactly. The aesthetic impact of those magenta veins is so loud, so arresting, that it temporarily shuts down the necessity for other sensory inputs. We see this in high-stress or high-infatuation environments all the time.
Like when you turn down the car radio so you can read a street sign?
That's 100% the same mechanism. When a single stimulus is overwhelmingly powerful, we unconsciously outsource the rest of our verification. Aang trusts the collective wisdom of others regarding the smell because the visual beauty has already sold the concept of the plant.
The brain just says, something this visually spectacular must smell sweet. I don't even need to check.
Right, visual dominance overriding physical reality.
Which, honestly, is the perfect bridge to the central conflict of this entire deep dive, because the aesthetic romance of those pink bells and magenta veins immediately crashes into the harsh botanical reality of how this specific plant actually functions in the real world.
Yes, the structural biology of the Podranea ricasoliana.
The visual seduction makes you forget about the mechanical skeleton holding it up.
And that skeleton is its defining flaw, or, well, at least its most demanding characteristic. Aang realizes, amidst all this infatuation, that this is a vine without tendrils.
A vine without tendrils? I mean, that feels like an evolutionary contradiction.
It really does.
If the entire goal of a vine is vertical mobility, lacking the equipment to climb seems like a catastrophic design failure.
To understand the deficit, you really have to look at the mechanics of a traditional climbing vine. Tendrils are marvels of cellular engineering. They rely on a biological mechanism called thigmotropism.
Okay, thigmotropism, that's a big word.
Yeah, it basically means directional growth in response to touch. When a tendril reaches out into empty space and lightly brushes against a solid structure, say a chain-link fence or brick wall, the physical contact acts as a trigger.
So the plant actually feels the wall.
Yes. The plant cells on the side of the tendril touching the structure slow their growth, while the cells on the opposite side rapidly elongate.
Oh, that's wild.
Right. This uneven growth rate physically forces the tendril to curl and tighten around the structure. The plant senses its environment and autonomously builds its own gripping mechanism.
It's essentially a self-tying knot. The plant is doing the physical labor of securing itself to the environment.
Exactly. And the exact opposite is true for the pink trumpet vine. It completely lacks this thigmotropic response.
So it's blind to the wall, basically.
Completely. It has no mechanism to sense a wall and no appendages to wrap around a support. Without autonomous mobility, it cannot climb. It can only push new growth outward.
Which is a problem.
A huge one. Aang specifically notes the biological consequence. If left to its own devices without human intervention, it will just sprawl across the ground, collapsing under its own weight into a messy, clustered shrub.
Okay, let's pull away from the biology for a second and look at the physics of this because it changes the entire dynamic.
Definitely.
Think about it like a brilliant but highly unorganized creative person. You know the type.
Oh, I know the type.
Without an external structure, like a strict project manager or a literal trellis, all that beautiful potential doesn't reach new heights. It just sprawls into a messy shrub of half-finished ideas.
That is painfully accurate.
It's like having all the raw materials for a suspension bridge, but it comes without any tension cables. You have the steel, the concrete, the beautiful leaves, the explosive pink flowers, but without massive external scaffolding holding it up, the whole thing just crashes into the ravine.
And that structural reality fundamentally rewrites the implied labor contract between a plant and a gardener.
The labor contract. I like that.
Yeah, I mean, when you bring home a tendril-bearing vine, the contract is a partnership. You provide the soil and a general boundary,
Yeah.
and the plant will figure out the verticality.
You do your part, the plant does its part.
Right. But a vine without tendrils shifts the burden of structural integrity entirely onto the human. It is no longer a passive decoration. It is a permanent, active architectural project.
You become the tension cables.
Exactly. You have to build the trellis. You have to physically lift the new growth, bind it to the wood with twine, monitor the tension, and constantly readjust as the biomass increases.
Which brings us crashing back to Eng's confession at the very beginning of the journal entry. The reluctance to buy vines was based on a specific, admitted skill gap. Remember, I'm unsure of how to train them against a wall or trellis.
Yes, the aesthetic allure of the magenta throat is demanding a level of mechanical competence that the gardener openly admits they do not possess.
It's a trap.
It is. It's a brilliant illustration of how beauty masks maintenance. The flower seduces you into underestimating the labor required to sustain it.
And this is where the tension peaks in the nursery aisle. Eng is holding the knowledge of the magenta veins against the harsh reality of the missing tendrils. A decision has to be made right then and there.
Take a cutting to evaluate, buy the whole plant, or walk away entirely.
And the outcome reveals a fascinating layer of human discipline. Eng walks away.
Just leaves it there.
Yeah, no impulsive purchase, no sample taken for the evaluation bench. The plant stays at the nursery, and the justification logged in the journal is coldly practical.
What were the reasons again?
First, Eng notes that there are already too many new plant species currently undergoing evaluation. The bandwidth for scientific observation is just maxed out. But the second reason carries the real emotional weight, I think.
The seedlings.
Right. There is a backlog of work waiting back at the garden, a growing list of fragile seedlings that are going to require transplanting very soon.
Walking away in that moment requires overriding a very deep evolutionary instinct. We are wired to acquire resources, especially rare or striking ones when we stumble across them. The rationale Eng provides gives us a profound insight into the mechanics of curation.
Okay, I want to challenge this idea of heroic discipline for a moment, though.
Oh, how so?
Well, when I read about the backlog of seedlings and the overloaded evaluation bench, I don't necessarily see a monk-like restraint. I see someone experiencing decision fatigue and capacity failure.
That's a fair point.
Like, is Eng truly exercising high-level discipline or just avoiding a total breakdown? Taking on a highly demanding, tendrilless vine when you already have a mountain of delicate transplanting work waiting at home isn't just undisciplined. It's a recipe for burnout.
You think it's survival?
Yeah. Maybe walking away isn't a triumph of willpower. Maybe it's just survival instinct kicking in. It's like leaving an incredible vintage coat on the rack simply because you know you don't have the closet space or the lifestyle to maintain it.
Whether driven by noble restraint or sheer exhaustion, the outcome is the same, and the underlying logic is incredibly sound. It hinges on the concept of protecting existing commitments.
Protecting the seedlings.
Right. Consider what a seedling actually represents. It is the most vulnerable phase of a plant's life. It is entirely dependent on timely, microscopic environmental adjustments, water, light, root space.
It's needy.
Very. Transplanting a seedling is basically a delicate surgical procedure. If you miss the window, the root system binds, and the plant's entire trajectory is permanently stunted.
So the seedlings represent the fragile foundational work that Eng has already promised to do.
They do.
Yeah.
Now introduce a demanding, mature, tendrilless vine into that fragile ecosystem. A plant that requires immediate, heavy architectural labor, trellis construction, and constant physical binding.
It would ruin everything.
That new vine will operate like a black hole for the gardener's time and energy. It will inevitably steal the highly specialized attention required by the seedlings. In horticulture, time is a zero-sum game. The hour spent tying the pink trumpet vine to a wall is an hour stolen from the seedlings crying out for larger pots.
Wow. Yeah, you cannot stretch time. You can only reallocate it.
And that forces a brutal prioritization. True curation, whether you are cultivating a garden, building a business, managing a team, or just organizing your own daily life, is heavily defined by what you refuse to take on.
That's a great way to put it.
The true expert isn't the person who acquires the most interesting things. The expert is the person who understands their own capacity limits well enough to walk away from something beautiful, specifically to protect the fragile scaffolding of the projects they've already started.
Discipline as an act of protection. That completely reframes the nursery visit for me. Leaving the vine behind isn't a defeat. It's building a defensive wall around the seedlings waiting at home.
And honestly, it's an act of protection for the pink trumpet vine itself.
Oh, that's true, because the plant requires a specific environment to express its potential.
Exactly. If Aang brings that vine home, fully knowing there is no time to build the required scaffolding and no technical skill to train it, the vine is condemned.
Right. That stunning aesthetic potential, the pink bells, the magenta veins, will never be realized. It will just collapse onto the ground and become that messy, clustered shrub Aang warned about.
By leaving it at the nursery, Aang honors the mechanical reality of the plant, rather than just acting on a selfish desire to possess its beauty.
And Aang does leave the door open, right? Noting a resolve to explore this species in the coming future if the opportunity arises.
It is a mature acknowledgement that timing and structural readiness are just as critical as desire. The beauty will still exist in the world, even if it doesn't exist in Aang's garden right now.
The narrative arc inside this single journal entry is just staggering. We started with a solitary gardener wandering into a nursery on a whim, fully armed with an intellectual understanding of their own limits.
And we saw how quickly visual dominance can short-circuit that logic. The mesmerizing architecture of a flower's throat, completely bypassing the need for physical verification, rendering the practical mind temporarily blind to the structural deficits of the plant.
Yeah, we took a hard look at the biological and physical mechanics of growth, the glaring absence of thigmotropism, the realization that a vine without tendrils is just raw material waiting for a human architect to build the suspension bridge.
The heavy labor contract hidden beneath the pink petals.
And we arrived at a really complex understanding of curation, the psychological tension between acquiring new beauty and honoring the quiet, demanding needs of the fragile commitments we have already made.
A masterclass in self-awareness, disguised as an April journal entry about a flower.
Truly. So as you step back into your own day, take a moment to look at the landscape of your own responsibilities. Think about the projects, the hobbies, or the sudden brilliant ideas you've taken on recently just because the surface aesthetics were simply too tempting to ignore. What are the vines without tendrils in your own life right now?
And perhaps the sharper question to ask yourself is, while you are frantically trying to tie that messy, unstructured shrub to the wall, what fragile foundational seedlings in your life are you quietly neglecting?
Sometimes the most expert move you can make is to acknowledge your own limits, turn around, and leave the beautiful thing right there on the shelf.